this video, we're going to look at how to summarize a categorical variable using SAS. Before we get started, you'll want to make sure that you have 3 files from Canvas and that you know where those 3 files are located on your computer. So the 3 different files are a CSV of the dataset, the codebook, and this is the same codebook that you saw in Module 3, as well as the SAS script that we're going to be looking at. Now, a word of caution with the dataset is very large. If you try to open up the dataset either in Excel or if you're on a Mac in one of the Mac programs, you run the risk of that program changing the file because it probably won't be able to open up the entire file because the file is so big. So when you save this file to your computer, do not open it in another program. We're only going to open it in SAS. So you just want to download it to your computer, put it in the folder, and then we're going to use SAS to open it. So the first thing we're going to do is we want to open up our script file in SAS. So there's a couple different ways you could do this. Notice I have SAS open in the background. If you double click on it, it will automatically open in SAS. You could also do File, Open Program, and navigate to where on your computer this is located. Now, if you are using the virtual DIN, for the virtual DIN, you will have to save this file in OneDrive, and this will be how you want to open it. So again, you'll go to File, Open Program, and then you'll want to navigate to your OneDrive, click on the file to open it here. All right. So the very first thing we're going to do is we are going to read in and edit the data. So the data file that you have is the BRFSS data for 2020 and a few observations from 2021 for all 50 states. What I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to show you how to take that full data set and create a smaller data set that only includes observations for the state of Kentucky for 2020. Now you're going to do the exact same thing, except instead of Kentucky, you're going to want to make that smaller data set for your state that you're working with. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to import the data. So there's 2 different ways that you can do this. We've seen both of them previously. So the first one, you can use a proc import statement. So the only thing that you will need to change here is you're going to need to change the file path where that data is located. So one way that you can go about this is if you open up the folder on your computer where it's located, you can click here and then you can just copy that in. Now make sure when you copy it in that you have the file path, and then you also need to have the name of the dataset.csv. If you're working in the virtual DIN, you may have trouble with this step. If you're having trouble getting it to read this step, you can use the import wizard that we saw with the very first software assignment. Alright, so once it is read in, you should see that it has 401,958,000 observations and 279 variables. And then, just as a reminder, if you are going to use the import wizard, how you do that is you go to File, Import Data. You'll want to click that you have a CSV file. Next, the file if you're using the virtual DIN now, the file has to be located in your OneDrive or another cloud storage, and remember that cloud storage has to be linked with your virtual DIN. So you will click Browse, go to the folder where it is located, click Open. Click on the data set, click Open. Next, you will have to give it a member name. So this name, for you to follow along with what I'm doing, will be exactly what I've got down here. It'll be BRFSS_data. So, and then you'll click Next. And I'm not going to finish just because I've already read in the data, but you would click Finish at this point. Just so you know, it may take a little bit, again, really big data set that you're reading in. Alright, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to create a new data set. In this video, it's only going to have data for Kentucky from the year 2020. So the first thing we need to do is we need to figure out how the state names are coded in the data set. So to do this, we're going to use our code book. So here I have the codebook pulled up. The codebook is a really big PDF, so I'm going to show you a trick for navigating PDFs that are large. If on your computer you hit Control F, or if you're on a Mac, I believe it's Command F, it'll pull up this little find. And you can use find to find different names in a data set. So we want to find the variable that looks at state. And so you'll notice the first thing that comes up here is the SAS variable underscore state, and this is the one that records which state the observations are from. So if I scroll down to Kentucky, I see that Kentucky is coded as a 21. So what I want to do is I want to find all of the observations from the data set that are from the state of Kentucky. So to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start out by naming what I want my new data set to be. So I want my new data set to be named Kentucky underscore 2020 underscore BRFSS. When you do this for your state, you'll want to pick a name that's sensible for your state. So if you're working with Ohio, for example, you might put the abbreviation for Ohio here. What this next line of code does is it says start out with my original data set. And then what it's going to do next is it says if state NE stands for not equal to. So if state is not equal to 21, then I want you to delete the row. And so in this case, that's just going to leave me with rows that are from the state of Kentucky. You'll want to find the number that corresponds to your state and do the same thing. And then there is another variable in the data set called iYear, and this one records the year that the observation was taken. And we only want data from the year 2020. So this line is saying if iYear is not equal to 2020, then delete. So we'll run this. Okay. And so looking at the log here, it read in all of the observations. Then it created a new one that only has 2,869 observations. So see, we have drastically reduced our data set, and it's going to be a much smaller and easier data set to work with. So when you go to run this step on your computer, the only things that you're going to need to change are the name of the data set. That's going to be, you'll want to name it something that goes along with your state, so you're probably just going to change these first two letters. BRFSS underscore data should be the same. So be careful if you do use the import wizard, make sure that this is what you name the data set. Then the only other thing you're going to change is this number right here, and you'll want the number that corresponds to your state. Now we can do some data checks. In the past we saw proc print. This data set's still pretty big, so I probably wouldn't use proc print on it to look at the entire thing, but you can look at proc contents, and what that is going to do is that's going to pull up the different data sets, or the different variables that are in the data set, and you can see there's 279 of them. Each one of these variables will correspond to a variable that's in the code book. So you can use this as a quick way to see the variable names and then search for those in the code book. Now, one thing you do want to be very careful of is keep in mind that all of the states ask the core questions, but not all of them ask all of the modules. So if you ever come across a variable and it looks like all of it is missing, always go back and check and make sure that your state asks the questions for that module. All right. Now the last thing we're going to do here is we've created this smaller data set. So now what we want to do is export that smaller data set to our computer so that we can use it later. So in all of the modules that follow this, we're never going to work with the full data set again. We're always going to work with this smaller data set. In this case, Kentucky 2020. In your case, it'll be for your state in 2020. So you can use the proc export to do that. So to do this, you're going to have work dot and then the name of that data set that you created up in this step up here. You will want to give it a location where the out file is going to go to. So in this case, I want it to go to that folder where I had my other files. So I'm going to replace the file path portion, but not the name of the file. So the very last piece should be the name of the new file that you want, and I want it to be a CSV, so it's going to be Kentucky 2020 brfss.csv, and notice these are underscores for the spaces. And then the rest of these are just saying that it's going to have a label and it's going to be saved as a CSV. So I'm going to run this. check my log, everything looks good. And if I open up that file on my computer, notice I now have a new data set that just contains the data for Kentucky in 2020. Now, if you are working in the virtual machine and you have trouble with this step, just like there's a proc import wizard, there's also a proc export wizard, and so that one may be easier to use on the virtual drive. So to do that one, you click on File, Export Data. It's going to pull up something that looks very similar to what you saw for the import. Now, under Member, you're not going to be able to type anything. These are going to be the data sets that were already used in SAS, and you should have two of them. The one is going to be the full data set. The second one is going to be the smaller data set. The smaller data set is the one that we want to save, so you'll click on that. Next, you'll want to save it as a CSV. Next, you'll want to tell it where to save the file, and you're going to have to save the file to your OneDrive. So I would navigate to the place where you have the other file saved. You'll need to give it a name. So in this case, Kentucky underscore 2020 underscore brfss.csv, and I'm not going to keep on going because you'll notice that data set is already in here from where I use the proc export statement. But you would then click save, and then you would go on to click finish, and it should export that data for you. So if you have any trouble with that, let me know. But again, using the virtual DIN, it may be easier to use the export wizard. All right, so let's see how we can create some frequency tables, bar plots, and pie charts in SAS. First, we're going to create a basic frequency table. So to do this, I'm going to use the proc freq statement. You'll notice the data I'm going to call here is that Kentucky data for 2020. And then I need to choose a variable that I want to make a table of. So in this case, I'm going to make a table of the education variable. So to read about this variable, just like before, what I can do is go to my code book, and I can search for either the variable name, or maybe I want to search for education to see if I can find a variable dealing with education. And so you'll see that this variable looks at education level. Here is the variable name, and here are the possible values. So this variable is coded as 1 through 9, and here are the different labels that those values represent. All right, so let's create a table. And here's our table down here at the bottom. Now, one thing to notice is in the actual data set, education again is coded as the numbers 1 through 9. So looking at this table, this isn't terribly informative for me because I have to go back to the code book to see what 1 through 9 represent. So it would be useful if I could add those labels into the table. And so here's how we can do this. We have to create what's called a formatting variable. And we do this using the proc format statement. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to write the word value, so that's not going to change for you. And then I need to create a formatting variable, or a format. So typically what I call these is whatever the name of the variable that I'm interested in, I will put that, and then FMT to stand for format. You can name this whatever you want, but I would suggest using something that matches the variable that you're interested in formatting. And then from there, what I'm going to do is for each of the numeric values that this variable takes, I'm going to write equals and then inside quotations what that value represents. Now, one thing to keep in mind is when you look at the code book, you'll see that these value labels are pretty long. These value labels, we're going to use these not only in tables, but also at the bottom of bar charts and pie charts, so we want to keep them concise. So whenever possible, do try to make these concise but still informative. So for example, for number 1, instead of never attended school or only kindergarten, I changed this to kindergarten or less. Instead of grades 1 through 8 elementary, I made the next one just elementary. Now after you list all of those out, the very last one needs to be followed by a semicolon and then the word run. So all this is going to do is it's going to create this education format. And then we'll use that format to create a better table. So here is our better table. You can use what is called the title to add a title to your frequency table if you want to. That step you don't have to. In the proc freq statement, I'm still going to call my data set. I'm still going to call that variable next to the word table, but notice I've added in this new line. And what it is I'm going to have the word format, so that won't change for you, the name of the variable, and then the name of that format followed by a period. So that period is really important. If you don't have the period, notice that it's going to be written in black, but as soon as I add the period, it changes it over to teal. So that lets you know that SAS is going to read that in as a format. So if we run this, notice we get a much better looking table, and now we actually have some pieces that we can read. Now, a couple notes on tables. We are going to use SAS to create the tables and to give us the values, but the tables that are inside of your reports, you do not want to use this formatting. The formatting for SAS for tables isn't great. They're not very pretty. So you will create the table in Word, use SAS to create the values or find the values, and then you'll fill those values in Word. So just because a value is given here doesn't necessarily mean you want to include it in your report. So by default, SAS is going to give you the frequency, the percentage, the cumulative frequency, and the cumulative percents. You don't need the cumulative frequency and cumulative percents for majority of variables are not going to be useful. Now with education, you could use the cumulative values here to say something like, 40% of people were a high school graduate or less. Almost 70% had some college or less in Kentucky. But again, for majority of variables, you're not going to use the cumulative frequency or the cumulative percent. The percentage is going to be the most important. So most of what you report for this course is going to be in terms of percentages, and that's because you're using sample data. You can use the frequency and the percent, but you don't want to use frequency by itself. So percentages are the most important things. Another piece of information here that isn't really useful is usually in a data set we'll have an abbreviated variable name. So in this case, EDUCA. When you actually write your report, you don't need to include that variable name. We will have a section at the end that tells what variables were used from the BRFSS, but when you're writing and describing things, you want to use something that's more descriptive. And so in this case, if you were going to write and describe it, you might say responses to what is the highest grade or year of school you've completed. So remember, it's always about clarity. All right, so let's kind of review what we just did with tables and talk about what it is you'll need to change for your data set. So for your data set, again, you'll want to change this data set name to whatever you created it for your state. More than likely, it's just going to be these first two letters or the abbreviation for your state. You'll want to change the variable name. Make sure you are summarizing a categorical variable. Next, you'll want to create a format to make your table easier to read. You can do this by creating a format variable, so that's what we've got here, and typically I just keep the FMT at the end and put the name of the variable out front. What values go here, those will come from the code book. So education had 9 different potential responses. Some may only have 3 or 4. And then finally, if you run a better table here, you'll still have the data. You'll call your variable name, the format you created with a period after, and then your variable name again. Now one thing to notice here is SAS is not case sensitive, so it actually doesn't matter if this variable name is lowercase or uppercase. All right, next let's look at how to create a bar graph. So to use the bar graph, create a bar graph, we're going to use proc sgplot. Again, we're going to call that data set. I'm going to give it a title. So here I'm going to work with that education variable again, and the title of my bar plot is going to be Education Level BRFSS Kentucky 2020, and you'll notice here I have N is equal to 2,869. When creating a bar plot, it's always a good idea to include the number of observations that were incorporated in that plot. So let's look at how we can get that number. We can actually get that number by going back to our frequency table. Remember that one of the columns in our frequency table is cumulative frequency. Cumulative frequency The very last number is going to be the total number of observations. I'm going to use that same formatting that we had up above so it labels my bars well. Here I'm going to do V bar. That means the bars on the bar chart are going to be vertical. You could change that to H bar to have horizontal bars. This fill attributes is going to control the color. So this bar plot's going to be red. You can change that to whatever you want. The y-axis is going to be counts, and the x-axis is going to be education level. So let's run this. And here we have a nice looking bar chart. Now there are a couple things on this I'd like to change, and I'm going to show you all how to do that. The first one is, again, in this course we're going to be primarily concerned with relative frequencies or percentages. So instead of counts, you're always going to want to have relative frequency or percentages. Also, notice that we have this refuse category. Most of the variables in the BRFSS have the options refused, don't know. Those aren't terribly informative when it comes to looking at this variable of interest. So for most of these, what you're going to want to do is actually remove this one, and then in a description of the plot down below, say that you removed it. So I'm going to show you how to remove those values. So the first thing we're going to look at is how to create a bar chart with relative frequencies, and again, these are the kind that you're really going to want for your report. Alright, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to recreate our table, but one of the things that SAS allows us to do is once we create a table, we can actually output pieces of that table to use elsewhere. And so remember, in that table, one of the pieces it gave us was the percentage. So I'm going to start out with my original data set. I'm going to use the education format again, and I'm going to create my education table. But now what I'm going to do is this piece of code is going to pull out those relative frequencies or pull out those percentages, and it's going to output something, and I need to give it a name. And so the name that I'm going to give that output is edu frequency out. So in other words, it's going to output that relative frequency for me. So we're going to run this. Okay. And so notice it goes ahead and creates a plot from the table with the percentages, but we can do better than this because notice the title's not that great. So what we can do is rerun the proc-sg plot to make a better plot. This time the data that I'm going to use is that data that was outputted from the table. I'm going to give it a better name. I'm going to use the V bar like I did before. You could use H bar. Now the y-axis is going to be percentages, and the x-axis is still going to be education level. And notice now we have a really nice looking bar plot with percentages. We still have that refused that I'd like to get rid of, so let's do that next. Alright, so SAS uses a period to denote missing numeric values. Remember that the categories here are stored as numeric, so we can use a period. So what we're going to do is we're going to set the refused value to be missing. And I've included a link here if you want to read some more about missing values in SAS. So I'm going to start out with my data set. I'm going to call it in. Set basically means, okay, I'm going to call in my data set, and I want you to go ahead and enter my data set as my new data set. I'm going to create a new variable called education no miss. I could call this no refusal, probably would have also worked as well. And that's just, I'm going to set it equal to my original variable. And then I'm going to say if my original variable equals 9, in other words the refusals, and I pull that from the code book here, 9 is equal to refuse. Then I'm going to set education no miss equal to missing. I'm going to run this. I'm going to use that proc contents that we saw earlier to look at the variables that are now in my data set. And if I run this, notice if I scroll all the way down to the bottom, I have this brand new variable that just got added. So then I'm going to do the same thing that I did before. I'm going to create a table, and I'm going to create a bar chart. So let's first look at our table. I had an error here. Oh, I've got the wrong year there, so let me fix that. And try running that again. And there we go. So notice here is my new table. So this one still has the refusals, and we can see that this is because when we created the table, we still had the education variable here, not the edu CA no miss. But notice looking at that table that we have 7 refusals. So now let's create our new table, and this time I'm going to call education no miss instead. And so here, notice that refusals are gone and they have been set to be missing. Then I can create a bar chart just like we did before. Now I'm going to call the education no miss instead of education. And here we have a really nice looking bar chart. One thing to keep in mind is education does have a natural order to it. So you do want to be careful that SAS isn't changing the order. This one looks fine. If that ever comes up, let me know and I can show you how to fix that. So we've removed the refusals. Now we do have the counts again. So, but then just adding in, just like we did before, using that output where we're going to output those percentages and relative frequencies. We can run these pieces, and now we have a great looking bar chart that would be good for your reports. All right. One thing to notice here is in the title, I did remove those 7 observations since those were removed. And when you put this in your report, you will want to put some kind of footer on this that says, 7 refusals were removed when creating this plot. So let's just kind of recap what we did with the bar charts and what you're going to need to do for your report. So you're going to want to create bar charts with relative frequencies. So this first bar chart here was really more for illustration and creating one with counts. So you can actually skip this step right here. And then you can start here for your bar charts so that you pull out those relative frequencies from the table and then create your plot. So to create this plot, the only things you'll need to change are the name of the data set, so you'll have the abbreviated name of your state here, the name of the variable you're interested in, and then that format that you created with the table. Name of the variable, and then you'll want to create some reasonable name here for what you're going to output. That abbreviation will probably deal with the variable that you are working with. You'll call this piece to actually create the plot. Give it a meaningful title. Make sure that you use the correct number of observations. You can change the color here if you want to, and you'll want to change the x-axis to be, dealing with your variable. Now, if the variable you're working with has refusals in it, you'll want to make sure that you follow these steps. And really the only big piece here that changes is you're going to run this step right here to set those unwanted pieces equal to 0. It may be that you have multiple values you need to set, probably not to 0, but to missing. If that's the case, what you can do is copy this line and just paste another one, and let's say if education equals 10, you also wanted it to be missing. You could add that in. And then from there, everything else is pretty much the same as the piece above it. It's just now you're going to work with the variable education no miss. And again, I could have called this no refusal. That may have made more sense there. And then you'll just continue to call it. So the overall structure of the code is not going to change. Really, all that's going to change is going to be the name of the data set and then the name of the variables that you're working with. So one thing that's important when looking at code is look for patterns. You'll notice that I'm using some of these names over and over again. So use that same pattern when you go to work with your variables. All right, so we've got one more piece to look at here. Almost forgot here, how to create a pie chart. So to create the pie chart, we're going to use proc gchart. It's very, very similar to what we did with the bar chart. So I'm going to run this so you see what it looks like. So here's what this pie chart looks like. So again, here my title, I've got pie chart of education level. Really what I think would be better is more what I had closer to the bar chart. So I'm actually going to change that title over to this one. It's a more informative title. I'm going to use that same format. Here I'm going to use the no miss variable, so in other words the one with the refusals removed. So in a footer on this plot I will need to note that I had removed those refused values. Running this. Now sometimes in SAS the labels for the pie chart won't show. If that happens, you can use this piece of code right here to fix it. And so you'll run this. The only thing that you're going to need to change here is the name of the data set and the name of the variable that it is that you're plotting. And then here you'll have a C underscore name of the variable. And you would then rerun the plot. And here's what that new plot would look like. Now a caution on pie charts in SAS, you will notice some of the lower values, or the values with lower frequencies rather, got grouped together, so it will do that automatically. The other thing is pie charts really aren't great if your variable takes very many values. So for this education variable, for example, I think that the bar charts are a much better choice compared to a pie chart. Pie charts, again, if you've got 2, 3 levels, pie charts are perfectly fine, but for your reports I mainly expect to see bar charts. Alright, so now that we've kind of went through some of the code and what it is you're going to need to change, the next thing I'd like to do is just talk a little bit about the software assignment you're going to have this week. So when you go into the assignment, you're going to see that I've already provided you a sample code, and really all that code is going to be comments. So this is the script that you're going to find on Canvas, and you'll notice here that I've already filled in these comments for you for where you're going to place the different pieces of code. So the first one is read in and edit the data. So when you go to work on your data, what I would do is go to the SAS code that we just went through, and for the read in and edit the data, I would just copy the code that we had here and I would paste it in. Now again, if you're using the virtual DIN, you might use the import wizard instead of proc import. If you use the import wizard, you'll want to delete out this code and then just put import the data using wizard, so I know that you use the wizard. Also, you might want to use the export wizard instead of proc export. If you're doing that, again, delete out the proc export and just put a comment that says export using the data wizard, so I know that. So, but after you copy that code in, then you can just go in here and make the changes as needed. So down here you'll want to change the state name to your state name. You'll want to change the number to be the number that corresponds to your state. Here to check the contents you would change the lettering or the name here to correspond to your state, and then same thing with the export. Then when you get down to frequency, again, go down here, go to the frequency table, copy the pieces that you need. You know that this first one wasn't very informative, so you don't actually need this piece of code. You can skip directly to the formatting in the better table and just copy those pieces in. So just because it's in the example doesn't mean it has to go into this file. Some of the pieces in the example are there for illustration, so you can kind of see the different steps. So you could just start with this piece here. Now education is one that a lot of people are going to have, so this one's perfectly fine to start with. You'll want to make sure that you call the data for your state. And then when you go to the second frequency table, you'll do the same thing down here, but of course you'll need to choose a different variable and edit those pieces of code. You'll then do the exact same thing for the bar graphs. So with the bar graphs, you'll want to choose what kind of bar graph it is you're going to create. We know that we really don't want the frequency ones. That one was more for illustration, so I wouldn't copy and paste that piece over. But I do know that I'm probably going to want to create one using relative frequencies. So for what I could do is copy over this piece of code. Now do be careful though, because notice this piece of code is going to call those formats. So if you made the format up in the table, you're fine to go ahead and reuse that. But if not, you might have to start with the proc format code here in the bar graph, create your format for the variable you're interested in first, then create the table, then create the plot. So just keep in mind kind of that workflow. The other thing, as you do this, you will want to, oops, I was copying that into the wrong spot there. You're going to want to make sure that you run the code little by little and look for errors. So don't, once you copy and paste this into frequency table 1, don't make all of the changes and try to run this all at once and figure out what went wrong. What you'll want to do is run it in pieces. And in SAS, each of the proc statements is a piece of code. So you would run this piece, see if there was an error. Then you would run this piece and see if there's an error. If you try to run all of it, if you make all of the edits and try to run it all at once, I guarantee you're going to have trouble troubleshooting and you're going to get some errors. So just tackle it one small piece at a time. And then also, as you're working on things and you're trying to troubleshoot, if you find yourself, you've been trying to troubleshoot for like 30 minutes and you're not getting anywhere, feel free to email me and ask me a question. But in order for me to help you, what I'm going to need is I'll need a screenshot of SAS. And in that screenshot, what I'm going to need, oops, is I'll need the log and I'll need to see your code. And so I've got my windows all messed up here. So I'd want a screenshot of something like this, the code you're running and the error you're getting. When you take a screenshot, please take an actual screenshot of your screen. Don't take a picture with your phone. Those can be blurry and they're hard to read. So I need an actual screenshot. I need you to send me this file right here that has your code in it so I can see that, and then just a brief description of what it is you're trying to do and the error that you're getting. And if you send me that, I'm more than happy to take a look and help you troubleshoot the code.